Much of what we learn about science, nature, and the environment happens outside of school and beyond the walls of museums, zoos, and nature centers. I have worked as an independent environmental professional for many years and know there are others like me who interact with the public in communities worldwide. On the Talaterra podcast, we discover who these professionals are, what they do, and how they create change. Why do I focus on independent professionals? I focus on them because they move freely through communities. They move freely between schools, organizations, businesses, programs, and other informal learning environments. They are positioned to meet the public where they are, and this is powerful. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Tania Marien. Welcome. Thanks for stopping by. Today we get to learn from Dr. Brad McLain. You might remember my conversation with Dr. McLain about identity theory and the professional identities of informal science educators. In this episode, we pick up the conversation where we left it and talk about Dr. McLain's new book called Designing Transformative Experiences. In his book, Dr. McLain leads experienced designers through the methodology that he developed over years of working with employees, students, corporations, museums, and nonprofit organizations like Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots. While you may recognize a transformative experience when you have one, do you know how to create one for the people you serve? If you design learning experiences for students, visitors to your site, colleagues, or your community, you'll want to listen to this conversation and bookmark this episode for easy reference. If you're a coach, trainer, or serve as a mentor in any capacity, you'll want to listen and bookmark this episode too. Are you ready? Let's join the conversation. Well, Brad, thank you so much for coming back to be on the show and also to talk about your new book. So when we last spoke, which was in 2021, we talked about a chapter that you had written about identity construction in informal science educators. And our conversation also touched upon transformative experiences. And you mentioned that you were writing a book that would focus on creating transformative experiences. And at the time, you shared that the working title of your book, you said the working title is Designing Transformative Experiences. And it turns out that is the actual title of the book.
We never came up with anything better. Well, we thought we might as well hit the nail right on the head.
Yeah. And your book is filled with incredible amount of information. And it's a thoughtful, methodical guide to this framework or system. I don't know if you use the word framework yourself, but that you call the Experiential Learning Variables and Indicator System. The acronym is ELVIS. And so thank you so much for joining us today and coming back with your book.
Thank you for reminding me that it was in 2021 that we last spoke, because of course a lot of water has flowed downstream since then, and the book is finished, and many of the things that we talked about in the last conversation were in formulation because I was still writing, and now it's and I do use the word framework, but I also use the word system, and it all is nested together. And I'm glad that you said it was methodical, because one of my goals was to try and bring these lofty ideas and philosophies and perspective down to a very practical, usable system and set of tools for leaders of all stripes to transformative experiences. How do you do it? There's a lot of information out there about what it is and what kinds of perspectives it requires, but how do you actually do it, nuts and bolts? That was in short supply.
Yes. Okay. So you walk readers or experienced designers. I'm going to use your language. And by the way, I just love that you use the word experiencers instead of participants or students or audience or something like that. It really reinforces, what you're doing and who you're working with.
Yeah. Experienced designers being one role, and everyone who might be fortunate enough to experience what that design is. I couldn't come up with a better word than experiencers. And it was a little bit of a rough ride for the early readers and my editor to say, is that the right thing? Is that really a word? And I was like, well, it should be. So yes, let's go with that because it's better than participants or subject audiences. It implies that they will have an experience that may be very interactive, and always into this framework that I put together is always co-created. It's not like the experienced designers creating everything and covering all the bases and variables and shoving it down the throats of people who might experience it. It's always a co-creation, and it really has to be. If we buy into the idea, which is a central idea to the book, that transformative experiences do not happen to us. They are created by us, whether we realize it or not. And so if that's true and they come from inside, they come from within, then the experiencer has the lion's share of the work to do. The designer is creating the optimum conditions for a transformation to take place.
Yes. So I will share with listeners that you walk experienced designers through 7 design elements of their Elvis system. You provide designer tips. You share stories of what's worked and what hasn't worked, things that you share your personal stories, things that you didn't see at the time when you were leading an experience, and that is so nice to hear and to read, and it's kind of like having you there because it's very personable. In the way that you write the book, it's like a personal guide, a walk, like you're there with the reader. And you share design strategies, approaches to evaluation, and you really equip the experienced designer with all the information that they need.
Well, thank you for saying that. That is a huge compliment because that was hopefully what I was achieving with that. But to hear you say that with your experience that we've talked about before, it's a tremendous compliment. Thank you. And the reason behind that, which was that very practical element, was years ago, I already had the Elvis framework. It was the idea that you had discomfort zone experiences, and that all of our experiences, especially those discomfort ones, are ultimately translated into narratives. That's step 2 of the framework, right? And these narratives, we seem to be hardwired to do narrative as a species, and we get into that quite in depth in the book, that if those narratives are powerful enough, important enough, they can influence or inform our most precious possession, and that is our identity narratives, those special stories that we tell ourselves and others about who we are in the world or who we want to become. And so when that identity impact happens, we have a transformative experience on our hands. Invariably a transformative experience is an experience that a learning experience that has an identity impact, changing the experiencer's sense of self in some important way. Why, that was all framework stuff. And I was actually asked many years to go do a TED Talk, which I did. And after the TEDx talk, I was inundated with questions. How can I apply your methods to motivating my employees, inspiring my students, enhancing my film or my game, tech designers doing video games, or my museum exhibit, all these people coming out. How can I motivate, inspire, enhance, apply? And I had no answers for them. So I had to go back and figure out, if this framework holds water, what does it look like on the ground for a leader who will be an experienced design leader. Asking experiencers to recast themselves as experienced designers opens up this perspective. But then you got to have the nuts and bolts to back it up.
Absolutely. And I love also that your book it takes an interdisciplinary approach. So it isn't just for museum staff. It's for everybody, because everybody can use the Elvis system.
As I say in the book, wherever mentor-protege relationships exist, and I think that exists in all facets of our lives, from leaders to educators to parents to coaches, and even really just us leading our own lives in many ways, as we are often apprenticing ourselves to ourselves. We have to sometimes become our own mentors, and then we have that kind of dynamic even internally. So it's a broad scope for sure, but it's actually very narrow because it's focusing on that mentor-protege relationship in whatever form it takes.
After your TED Talk, and I'm sure many times since then, people have walked up to you and say, I want to explore what you've done. How do they identify themselves as, or present themselves to you?
Yeah, a lot of people come up. In fact, I was just doing a keynote at a conference on Friday, and a lot of people have come up even after that one, and they usually explain what their role is at work at first. I am an educator. I am a corporate executive. And here's what I do, or here's the challenge I'm facing. And then going on from there, asking in some form, how could Elvis work for me? Elvis being, like you said, the experiential learning variables and indicators system that's behind this whole thing, and the 7 elements of it. Well, of course, you're having a short conversation after a keynote talk or something. You can't go into all 7. You can't go into the designer tips and stuff, but you want to say something that's valuable as a take-home message. And, one of the things that I always emphasize is that to be an experienced design leader invites us to a backwards design model. If we know that all experiences will ultimately be translated to narratives, leaders, whatever their challenge they brought up or whatever their opportunity they brought up and asked a question about, I usually say, what is the narrative you want your experiencers to walk out of the door with after the experience that you've designed is done? And again, you can't force that narrative. You have to co-create it, but there are practical ways to structure that. And so then that invites into a dialogue. Thinking about the outcomes in terms of the narrative is different. So once they start to describe the narrative they'd like people to construct or generate from an experience with them under their leadership, then we have something to talk about. How do we achieve that narrative? How can we design for that narrative? How can we help participants co-create that narrative inside the experience? And it's embedding narrative generation structures within the experience, not just at the end, not like just a debriefing or something, or let's make meaning or pin the tail on the donkey at the end of the show. No. We got to put it in the middle there and make sure that we've got a healthy, robust, ongoing narrative construction going on.
Yes, and that signal, that message is clear throughout the book, that this isn't just a summary, or as you said, a debrief. And so it's all about structuring for meaning making, which is it's a heavy thing to think about. And because you never know what your audience is or what they're bringing with them. And so how do you teach people or show people, or designers, how to pick up on the signals of an experiencer's experience? How do you train for that?
It's such a great question, and it takes on different flavors depending on your environment. So if you're an educator, it might look a little bit different than if you're an executive in a corporation. But there are some common elements, and the whole first part of the book is about unpacking the common elements that have to be there for a transformation to occur. And going deeper into those discomfort zone experiences, risk is at the very top of the list of indicators and variables that we can use as tools, right? But in all cases, discomfort zone experience is a risk invitation. And as designers, we can design risk invitations for people. And then they are faced with a risk decision. Will they accept it? Will they reject it? Will they kind of accept it, or in part? And then there's the risk outcome. And all of these have to be attended to if you're an intentional designer. I would argue that even if you're not, you're an educator or a leader of a team of any kind, if you do not attend to this experience design and this translation of the experience into narrative, it's going to happen anyway by default. And so it's a missed opportunity. If we use it as a design tool, we can, instead of by default, by design, create these opportunities for risk or risk invitations. Then we're on the right track. So the question becomes, what kind of risk invitations can I use or would indicate that I'm on the right track? In order to answer that question, you really have to get into the identities of your experiencers. You have to know your audience in a sense, because what's risky to me may not be at all risky to you. We have an inverse relationship between our sense of risk and our sense of agency. What I think I can do is lower risky, but if I'm presented with an invitation for something I don't think I can do, I have low agency, then I have high risk. Also, as we go into the book, we break down risk quite extensively. There's different kinds. There's physical risks, emotional risks, intellectual risks, and social risks. And this is a wonderful toolkit for the designer. It's like having many more colors in your painting palette for you to make these designs with. And so what kinds of risks will I design for, combine, look for, and invite different experiencers to, so that I'm sure I'm providing a quality discomfort zone experience with the opportunity for identity growth.
Yes, so you are creating a brave space for that type of growth. Recently I interviewed two teachers who run a diversity and nature education program, and the DEI instructor, Camille Edwards, said that they purposely design for brave spaces instead of safe spaces, because there is no such thing as a safe space.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that's exactly what this is in terms of discomfort zone. A lot of my work does have to do with inclusive leadership in the companies that I work with. And you do have to acknowledge and have everyone else acknowledge that this is a uncomfortable space. And it needs to be in order for that kind of growth to happen. So there may be some safeties there, some encouragement, but at the end of the day, it's a brave space requiring some courage, requiring some risk, requiring experiencers to make a risk decision. Interestingly, in my research, I found that making the risk decision is sometimes more important than the risk outcome itself. In other words, deciding to take a chance on something as an experiencer may be the highest hurdle for me that has the most impact on my identity, regardless of if it turned out well because of that risk or it turns out badly because of that risk. And I'll give you an example. Years ago, I began working with Jane Goodall's Roots and Shoots education program. And Roots and Shoots is all about empowering kids to make a difference in their local communities, make a difference in terms of the lives of people, animals, or the environment. And they used to run projects. These were student-led projects to do something in their community. It might be cleaning up a nature area. It might be helping raise money for the local animal shelter or the homeless shelter, whatever it might be that the kids decided was needed there. And these projects would invariably succeed and fail and everything in between, But Jane's message from the start was always, you don't have to wait until you grow up to make a difference in the world. You can do it right now, and everyone makes a difference. It's just up to us to decide what kind of difference to make. When I first heard this, I was realizing the real goal of Roots and Shoots is identity change. And that is to say, we are successful, whether the project that the kids do, we will be successful even if their project fails, if they've generated an identity as a change agent, as someone who can make a difference. And maybe their project failed, but the resiliency of coming back, trying again, or starting a new project is what makes a change agent successful, no matter their age. So we went about revising the Roots and Shoots format so that those qualities of a compassionate leader, of a change agent, those identity qualities are forefront. And the campaigns, although still important, the projects that they do are still important. They're not central. It puts the learner, it's a learner-centered approach instead of an outcome-centered approach. And so it was a wonderful way to recognize risk decisions, taking that chance and making an effort, often more important than if you fully succeeded or partially succeeded or utterly fell flat on your face. as we always say, go ahead and fail, but let's try and fail forward, if we're going to do that.
Yes. Now, after you talk about risk in the book, you talk about control and how transferring control to the experiencer, how that has to be timed just right. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Oh, yeah. It's the locus of control. So right after risk, and very closely associated with it, is control. And what we know about transformative experiences is that when people report having them, they report a shift of control inward. And that is to say, more agency, more decision-making power in the experiencer's hands. For designers, this means we need to look for opportunities to transfer control to the experiencers. It might start out with us as the designer. Maybe we've convened the experience and set everything up and the whole sequence of events that are going to happen. But we're also slowly starting to more and more co-create this experience with learners. But of course, different audiences are different. So if you're working with young kids, you can't just give them a whole bunch of control. They need a little bit more structure. But you can move that needle more towards learner control as you go. With adults, it's somewhat the same. You can't just throw them off the deep end and abdicate your responsibility as a designer. You have to recognize when and where your experiencers can and should rise to a level of decision making. And this can happen in three different ways. The pre-experience, where you invite people in to help frame up the experience to come, to help begin to form the bonds amongst the cohort of experiencers that they will be joining. And that whole pre-experience phase, we call framing and priming in the book, is really critical to the kind of experience that they will have, that they will be available to have. The second area is the experience itself, what I think of as the main event. And that's where we really look for ways to transfer control to the experiencers. Now, the challenge for designers is it will be different for different experiencers, because you might have people saying yes or no to your risk invitations based on the identities they've walked in with. As a designer, I need to know more about those identities in order to transfer control effectively. Short answer, one size does not fit all. And then the third component, and the most neglected one for leaders of all stripes, parents, teachers, educators, corporate executives, is the post-experience. Many times, the most powerful effects of an experience are still happening after the experience itself is over, because we're reflecting, we're absorbing, we're integrating, we're making meaning, and those narratives are coming together. So there's a co-creation opportunity for the designer and the experiencer to collaborate after the main experience is over in making that narrative something that's personally relevant. And if it's a transformative experience, not just relevant, but changing their identity narratives, which has a ripple effect throughout their lives.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And this ripple effect, then, immersion is the next element in your system. How do you plan for immersion, measure for immersion, especially if it goes beyond, if this experience continues beyond, how do you control for that?
Of course, the immersion, when you have an experience that you've designed, you're thinking about how the immersion refers to, by the way, the physical immersion of all of our senses. And by the way, there were many more senses than just six. We have senses of hunger and emotions that come into it, in addition to our physical senses of sight, taste, touch, hearing, smell, and all of proprioception being the sixth one, but also all these other ones that help us narrate our experiences. But there's also this imaginative immersion, which we talk about in the book, which is the capacity that humans, and possibly non-human animals as well, have to transport themselves or be transported into another realm, another experience that may be in an imaginary way. Narrative transport is that effect you feel when you've been reading a book and you get so absorbed in the book world that you look up and, my God, 2 hours have gone by. What happened? Or a movie, or some sort of narrative that sweeps us away. That's narrative transport. And it requires imaginative immersion. So as designers, we say, what could we do in our designs to activate the physical immersion, the senses, and let's engage people on as many levels as we can in combination with an imaginative immersion. That's back to our framing and our priming. What kind of narrative will be generated from this experience? Maybe it's a test of will narrative. Maybe it's a coming of age narrative. Maybe it's a triumph or tragedy or anything in between. There's a whole bunch of different kinds. And so I would look for opportunities in the design of the experience to activate this immersion. Now, at the end of the day, afterward, and you mentioned ripple effects, how do we make sense of that immersion? And what will it do to our world perspective and our self perspective after the experience is over? And that's where ripple effects are. We find that when people have a transformative experience, it's unstoppable and it ripples through every area of their lives. And the people closest to them, children, spouses, bosses, family, will also notice this change and may undergo some changes of their own as the relationship with the transformed individual continues. And that's a very good indicator, by the way. It can be difficult, but it's also a growth indicator.
Throughout this book, I was thinking about, my own experiences, just the different things that I've been involved in. And what kept coming up for me is that for me, the most recent transformative experience is my work with the Carbon Almanac Project, because that was a huge group experience. People who didn't know each other, volunteers from 40 different countries helped contribute to the book, and then even more, afterwards doing resources and all that. And that just kept coming up for me. Yeah.
Yes. And when I hear stories like that, and congratulations, by the way, tremendous experience, I usually ask people, what was your most transformative experience so far or most recently? Where were you? What were you doing? Who else was there? How old were you? But after all those details are stripped away, the final question is, how did it change you?
Yeah.
How do you think your experience changed you in your most recent transformative experience? That's the question that ultimately defines the transformation.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that answer keeps coming years and years later. We don't stop. Those experiences continue to affect us throughout our lives, and we might change the way we narrate them. In other words, we might change the meaning we ascribe to them as we get older. Mm-hmm. In the same way as we can go back and read a book, that book is the same as 20 years ago, but it means something different to me now. Or hear some music that we've loved and thought we had a handle on, but now when we're older, it means something completely different, or we didn't see or couldn't be available for earlier. Same is true with our experience narratives. When we revisit them and retell them, they can change. It's a wonderful effect of this perspective, this experience design leadership in Elvis, is that we can go in and edit and modify and grow our narratives. And once we have one or more transformative experiences, we start to merge those narratives in different ways into the story of who we are. As that often happens, once you've had one transformative experience and you get the hang of it, it's like you become available for more of them in a snowball way. Yeah. Hopefully they're mostly positive ones. They're not all positive, right?
And how many sectors have you worked in and led conversations with your Elvis system?
A lot. Elvis was born out of my experiences in education and being non-formal, informal, and formal education years and years back before it was Elvis at all. But it really came to its maturity in my work with corporations, large tech companies, the largest companies in the world you've heard of, and the smallest ones you've never heard of, and everything in between, working with seasoned veterans and top leaders and executives, all the way down to entrepreneurs trying to bootstrap it. And the thing they have in common is that they're always working with teams. You could be in the largest company in the world, but your team is, 10 or 15 of your direct reports. That's the same as most other companies, even if they're not the largest in the world. With classrooms, with formal education, their cohorts, their experiencers are 20 to 30. Informal education or non-formal education, you might have small groups of 5 to 10. But that cohort, that granularity of the team level experience is where Elvis and Designing Transformative Experiences is really intended to shine. It's something that requires personal relationships. It's something that requires an awareness by the designer of who walked through the door for this experience. And not just who else walked through the door, but who am I walking through the door as the designer? Invariably, a transformative experience informs the designer's identity as well. And we find this dynamic in all the different transformative experiences, this co-creation of meaning. In other realms, I've worked with coaches for athletes and athletic teams. I've worked with designers of video games and other software challenges across the board. I've worked with parents and families in this regard as well, and also the training of other kinds of leaders from government organizations to nonprofits. Again, I go back to it. I had to say it in the book because it covers so much ground. Wherever mentor and protege relationships exist, this psychology is in play.
You have developed a website that complements the book, and you provide even more information there for designers. It's really just amazing. It's the companion content, as you've listed it on the website, is by chapter. So you can go through each chapter and find, extra information or find the key questions that you walk the readers through. It's really an incredible resource that you've made. You're really making this, it's not easy. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of emotional labor, and that comes through as well. This is not a fill in the blank template. This is emotional labor.
There's emotional labor, cognitive load, but it can't be any other way. If it's worth our time, it's going to be worth. And the website was kind of interesting. My book got longer and longer, and my editor started sweating more and more, and biting her fingernails. She said, "No, we can't." And yet, look around at the evolution of the publishing industry as content is delivered, yes, between the hardcovers and soft covers of books, but also in combination with those online and social media outlets. So I suggested, why don't we put a lot of this online and make the book shorter? But if people want to dive into something more, jump to the website, not only read up on some of this companion content, but also contribute their stories in our transformative experience forum, or access online versions of the tools that are in the book to make them easier to use, and offer some services and continued learning. I really think of it as a book/online presence of the book, the bibliography also being online, and so that people have different points of access for it. And also, you don't have to haul a book around with you after you've read it. You can just pull out your phone and go to the website, get reminded of what it is, or just-in-time tools that you might need as a designer. And so that became a larger project than originally intended, to build that website. It's ongoing work in progress. And I'm very thankful to be working closely with Jayanti, who I run many of my workshops with now. She's my fiance, and she's an adaptive yoga specialist. So she specializes in presenceful meditation and mindfulness practice in the context of being a yogini, which goes hand in hand with the kind of presence needed to engage as a designer of a transformative experience. Because we've said transformative experiences always emanate from within. As designers, we have to understand that inside ourselves before we can presume to design such experiences for other people. This requires a level of presence and presence-full practice that is the beginning of most of our workshops, and then going on from there with these practical psychological tools that we can use in our work.
It takes a lot to make a program personally relevant to your experiencers. Yeah.
It takes a lot, and it takes them showing up as a co-creator, which is a great point, by the way. You go to the ends of the earth. designing an extraordinary experience, hopefully a transformative one for many people, but not everyone will have or be available for that kind of transformation. What you've designed may transform some, but never all of the people in your group or your team or your cohort or even a one-on-one situation. That doesn't mean it's not worthwhile. Many of the tools are still going to serve to make an extraordinary and impactful experience. But to bridge over to that holy grail of transformation in the sense of having an identity impact, that will happen with a fraction, maybe half, maybe slightly more than half of the people that you're designing for. If you've done your due diligence, explored the narratives that they're creating, the identities they're walking in with, and all of the different factors. But in all of these cases, extraordinary or transformative, this is a different view on leadership that opens up a wonderful toolbox of psychological, psychobiological, and social science research that usually leaders don't encounter in more traditional forms of leadership training or professional learning or coaching experiences. It's a different view, which can be scary, but it also is a wild ride into something completely different, even for seasoned leaders, especially for seasoned leaders.
Yes, yeah. And another thing that comes through with your book is that to do this work, you have to be willing to embrace uncertainty from all corners, all aspects, and also be able to help the experiencers do that as well, because that's all part of the process.
And uncertainty in many forms. The risk, of course, has uncertainty, which makes it risky. But there's also this concept of emergence, which people will know about in social science research. But also, I pull out some examples from the video game design industry with Robert Wright's work in emergence, what he would call possibility spaces. It's designing for empty spaces where the experiencers can fill in the blanks a bit, and different things will emerge from an experience because you've allowed a lot of latitude there that you could never have designed for. Elements of the experience or outcomes from the experiencer's point of view that you did not intend. And we know this will always happen. We can't design for it, but we can be ready for it and expect it, so that when it comes time to make the narratives and integrate all of the experiential components into the narratives that may have an identity impact, what emerged that was surprising or unexpected to all of us, designer and experiencers alike? These are some of the richest conversations that I've had with my experiencers. And it informs the next time I go to design a similar experience for somebody else, that emergence of things, that unpredictable element. It's kind of scary again, but once you embrace that unknown element as a designer or an experiencer, make a friend of the unknown, then its gifts can reveal to you.
To your point that you just made, the key idea here about failing, you mentioned earlier failing forward, but you have I pulled this out as a quote. The key idea here is that failure is not the opposite of success, it's part of success.
This is a common refrain, one of my favorite bits of bumper sticker wisdom that leadership coaches have been using in many forms and many audiences for many years. That failure needs to be reframed as one of our most important tools. Yeah, it's often the case that we learn more from our failures than our successes, with one big proviso, that we have that mindset, a growth mindset, as Carol Dweck would say, to see our failures that way and explore and unpack and share them. If, on the other hand, we treat failure as something that's to be hidden, shunned, swept under the carpet, or even denied, no way I could fail, then we close ourselves and everybody else off to the possibility of learning from that failure, which may be a deeper, richer learning experience than just having succeeded. So what are the tools that a designer can use to ensure that failure is, one, a real possibility? Not everybody's going to succeed. When I take people up a mountain, for example, I never expect all of them will summit. And many of them may view not summiting as a failure, But I've set up structures so that if they don't summit, if they don't succeed in that framing that they've done, that there's still learning and success to be experienced. And this brought on the idea of personal summits. You will go as high as your body will take you, facing the weather, the altitude, the terrain, the internal environment of fatigue and energy, all those things that conspire to determine where your personal summit is. Your personal summit may be at the top, where there's no more mountain to climb, but it may be at tree line. It may be at that stream or that fork on the trail, right? And that's your personal summit. Claim it, explore it, soak it for all that it has to teach you, because none of us have the same perspectives on life or ourselves. We all have unique ones, and your perspective is every bit as much right as my perspective or any famous and powerful person's perspective to exist and be heard in the world. So what are those fail-safe mechanisms? What are those fail-forward design elements that we can use as designers that have to be in there, because we don't know when it might happen, but it's going to happen? Is that you present a risk invitation. Failure is going to be part of the equation. We go deeply into that in the book, actually.
Yes, you do. And when you talk about your excursions, they're outside.
Well, a lot of them.
Yeah. And so it's not like in a classroom or room or some controlled setting. And so I'm thinking, oh my gosh, how many times did you have to go on an excursion to create the best experience?
I used to think naively that transformative experiences had to be found out there on the crazy adventures of life, So I did my first documentary, which was Everest ER, about the emergency room at the base of Everest. I thought that's where we needed to go to find these life and death kind of transformative experiences. At that time, I didn't consider the possibility that you could have a transformative experience walking down to the local coffee shop. But you can. And in fact, more often, that's the way it happens. You don't have to go climb a mountain or put yourself physically at tremendous risk to have a transformative experience. Yeah. And so what are the elements that we can learn from those really death-defying kind of experiences that maybe make it clearer what the design elements may be, but then bring them back into the classroom? And so there are many stories in the book about applying it to learning in the classroom or travel experiences in some cases, or any kind of relationship experience that we might have. We find these things coming out of the woodwork all over the map. And going back to one of the examples you brought out from a prior conversation you had on diversity, equity, and inclusion, that conversation that we have with leaders about their internal cultures is tremendously risky for leaders who are used to talking about algorithms and problem solving and quarterly revenue reports and deadlines and all these kinds of things are in their comfort zone. But especially in my work with NCWIT, the National Center for Women in IT, when we go in with our teams to help companies make their teams more inclusive, we are issuing a risk invitation to those leaders to have a discomfort zone experience without even leaving the room. So we encounter risk, discomfort, control, all the other 7 Elvis elements right there, right then, without ever having an outdoor adventure.
And so for the listeners, I'll provide an overview of all the elements here. For the Elvis system, there's risk, then control, immersion, social and emotional involvement, intellectual challenge, identity matters, and meaning making.
Yes, and I would add the last one, the 8th part of Elvis is the holistic Elvis. Mm-hmm. A holistic being. The combination of these is greater than the sum of the parts. And so they're all really good tools to dabble in if you're a leader. But if you want to be an Elvis experience design leader with the whole framework at your disposal and all these 7 tools, putting them together yields something more powerful for transformation to occur. It's no accident that the book is filled with stories. And some of them are mine, and many of them are people I've worked with and people I've heard about, because that narrative element is central to experience design leadership. What kind of narrative do I want my experiencers to walk out of the door with? And how can I backwards design to make that more likely? That simple stance alone is what unleashes the power of all of these psychological tools for leaders to have a bigger impact, to go beyond the usual things leaders do, And people are crying out for this right now. I can't tell you the number of leaders I've worked with and spoken with who in the COVID era are looking for something deeper, looking for something more fulfilling. And the workers too. This is related to wanting to work from home, where we have more work-life balance, having more control, flexibility over our destinies at work, making sure that we are not just our jobs. Well, leaders feel that too. And so when we look at how are we changing the ways that we think about work and want to work in this COVID era, this idea of experience design is a powerful tool that we can apply to that challenge, in my opinion.
You've worked with companies, groups, people who've reached out to you to work with you and learn with you and customize their own experiences. How can listeners learn from you and go beyond the book experience, which, as I mentioned earlier, is truly emotional labor? Once you really sit and reflect and think for yourself through all these questions that you ask, consider the practitioner, the designer tips that you provide. How can they go beyond the book?
Well, one great place to start is our website, Designing Transformative Experiences.com. Same title as the book. And there you can engage directly. Send me a note. Start a conversation. It always starts with a conversation. But like you said, there's companion content on there. And it's still a work in progress as we add more and more of the online learning components. And there'll always be some refreshing of that part of the website going on. Those are great ways to engage as well. But there's really no substitute for starting a conversation and saying, should we do some work together? Should we do some workshops? Should we bring this to teams in different ways? And what would fit for you? We always customize the basic information that's in the book to tailor it for the needs of a specific client or partner in many cases. I mentioned the Roots and Shoots example earlier with the Jane Goodall Institute. Looks very different than when we go into a big fintech firm and they're dealing with their teams across the world, across cultures too. How does a transnational organization with transnational teams embrace this methodology? Very different. So it always starts with a conversation, reaching out. Also, once you get going in this business of experience, design, leadership, start using the tools, you'll become part of a community of people who are doing it and using that language, that jargon, those concepts as a framework for talking about not only their goals, but their success. Because to adopt this stance of transformative experience design is to move the goalposts, to change the definition of success beyond just quarterly revenues and the things we were talking about before, or good grades for your students, or learning objectives. All of that stuff is important. But we can go beyond that with these Elvis tools to talk about fulfillment and identity construction and pro-growth identity experiences. And that's different language and conceptualization that says we can be more than we are today.
Yeah, identity construction. That I really attach myself to. I mean, I think that's so important just in so many different conversations you can have when you're trying to create the conditions for a conversation. Identity is always a part of that somewhere in there. And how do you do more with a conversation?
Yeah, and I found people really need a little basis in identity theory in order to make the best use of it. There's a whole chapter on identity theory in the book to lay a baseline, a groundwork to say, what does it mean to incorporate identity matters into my design, into my work? Is that the same as identity politics? I get that question a lot. No, that is not the same as that. However, we will talk about intersectionality. We will talk about narrative identity. We will talk about the narrative study of lives and all the wonderful researchers who are contributing to that area of psychology, because it has to do with who we are becoming. 3 questions I always like to ask my corporate teams or any other teams is, what are we doing? How and why are we doing it? And most importantly, who are we becoming as we do it? This echoes conversational leadership as articulated by the poet David White in his work. Who are we becoming while we do it is an identity question. that we don't often take the time to ask and maybe not know how to answer. And that's another perspective that this experience design leadership incorporates, the critical foundational component.
Well, thank you for this book. And, all sorts of, again, with all bells and whistles have gone off with this book, just like with your chapter that I read. And, and all different ways that I want to apply this or incorporate Elvis into podcasting, into my solutions journalism, endeavors that I'm working on and all that. Yeah. Well,
thank you very much for having another wonderful conversation together. And may we have many more.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you. Yep. I look forward to that. To learn more about designing transformative experiences and to buy a copy of Dr. McLain's new book, go to designingtransformativeexperiences.com. Here you will also find companion content for each chapter. You'll also find the opportunity to join a community dedicated to creating the conditions for transformation. Now remember, this community isn't just for academics, museum staff, or teachers. It's for anyone in a mentor-protege relationship. Thank you for joining us today. See you next time.